Hello and welcome to the Construct Cast, the place where we like to build ideas together. My name is James Darian, and I am your host. So, today I would like to discuss a bit more about the supply and demand of liberty, specifically something that I like to consider the elasticity of liberty. So, if you know anything about economics, you might know that supply and demand is the basic way that price is judged, the way that an equilibrium is found between what people want and what people are willing to give up to get what they want. So the supply and demand of liberty, which I have written about in a post, so I'm not going to be going over it specifically here, but it's basically how people will transact their liberty. Instead of for a payment, they will typically pay in something like security or a feature such as that. So, considering this, I want to now look at what I consider the elasticity of liberty, that being how much liberty, at what rate are people willing to give up liberty for their security. In this case, to say something it is inelastic, that would basically mean that people are readily able to give up their liberty for a small gain in security. The more elastic something is, the less they're willing to give up to get more. The less elastic something is, the more they're willing to give up, essentially. So, and I'm thinking of this a lot because I'm thinking of what our government has done over the years to make people more willing to give up their liberties. Now, if you think of America, the top thing people think of is freedom. That is probably the most defining trait of America. It is the thing that makes America the most unique. So when we look at what we would assume to be the supply and demand of liberty for America, you would think it would be very elastic. You would think Americans are not willing to trade much of their freedom for security. However, I would like to bring about some attention to things that our government has done to convince us to be more willing to give up liberty for security. So, if we even just go back 20 years, let's just look at the past 20 years for now. We can start back in the year 2000, not too long after the year 2000, we had 9/11 in 2001. That was definitely a moment that changed America. It was an attack designed to change America, and in a way, it's sad to say that seems to have worked, because the fact is that we followed up that attack by enacting the Patriot Act. And what people don't necessarily realize is just how much of their liberty was lost because of that. There's been NSA spying, there's been numerous wars, there have been numerous wars, and there have been actions used that were defined to be used against potential terrorists that have been used against all Americans. We know this from the Snowden leaks and from other reports. I believe that it was recent that the NSA spying was deemed unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. Someone fact check me on that, but I believe I saw a report on that. So we can already see that there is something that happened in wake of a tragedy that gave the government a lot more power over the citizens. And it isn't necessarily constitutional, but they were still able to get away with it for decades. And we are lucky now that some of this has been deemed unconstitutional. It's gone through the courts. But we have that back then. And then in 2008, we had the Great Recession happen. That's when that started, and government started bailing out companies, selecting and choosing which companies to bail out. Specifically, though, it wasn't just carte blanche across the board. They definitely picked and chose winners and losers, and that is I suppose that's a topic for another time, but we can see how people began to get desperate back then, and the movement in order to combat some of that was the Tea Party movement. You could see it back when it came out, and yet the Tea Party movement, despite affecting people on both sides of the political spectrum, despite being both a Democrat and Republican thing during the 2010 elections, there was eventually a backlash and a media slant that the Tea Party movement was basically a right-wing conspiracy. That is what I was able to tell from it. That was what I gathered from my experiences during the time, though if you felt differently, you can link me some sources. I would love to see some more positivity regarding the Tea Party movement, but what I saw was a lot of negative coverage, and it seemed to very specifically be targeted against people who are fighting for our liberty, who are believing in the foundation of our country. No taxation without representation. We were getting taxed excessively, and all these regulations were coming in. It was a lot of change. We had Obamacare, which was being marketed as not a tax, and then when it went to the courts, they said, oh, it's a tax. So that is a clear sign that people were right to protest at the time about taxation without representation, because they were representing us and telling us it wasn't a tax, and then they said it's a tax. So you can see how there is that American fight against tyranny, against losing our freedoms, but there's also a part that just accepts it, and the fight for our freedom ended up being labeled something of an outsider move. It was labeled as fringe in a way. So looking at that, we can fast forward a little bit. You get to I'll just bring it up to the pandemic right now, and immediately when we heard there was a health pandemic, suddenly our freedom became very inelastic. Otherwise Americans would never have subjected themselves to a lockdown in the first place. But through use of a lot of fear, from what I call the 24-hour hate cycle, the media coverage that runs all day, just riling people up, trying to make them have an emotional response to everything that they're putting out there, that is very unhealthy, but it was very functional in getting Americans to be very willing and compliant with giving up a lot of their freedoms. So when I talk about this, I'm basically exploring a bit of a shift in the demand curve for liberty. We're seeing some rebound right now, and we saw some over the weekend with counter protests against the lockdown. And while I am very happy to see that, the part that worries me, because I know we still have those Americans who are strictly freedom inelastic. They want freedom before everything else. I am one of those Americans, and I believe in that mindset. I believe in that promise of America. And it is scary when we're seeing all the media basically malign these people as conspiracy theorists. We're seeing counter lockdown protests. We're seeing protests against the people who are protesting the lockdown. We are seeing protests that are accepted for more authoritarian measures like Black Lives Matter pushing for Marxist ideals while simultaneously having these lockdown ending protests being lambasted as spreading the virus, while these other protests are deemed glorious, righteous, and helping to fight the virus, because apparently viruses now care about politics. That is something that worries me a lot, because we're not just seeing it from a few politicians trying to power grab. We're not just seeing it from Congress like we did with them wanting to be able to respond to a terroristic threat and then overstepping their bounds. We're seeing it from the people themselves falling for some propaganda that has left them in such a state where they don't believe in freedom anymore. At least it seems that they don't believe in it, or they don't realize that they believe in it. I'm sure a lot of these protesters have this idea of freedom where they believe there is a lot that they should do, that they can do, and that the government shouldn't be able to get in their way from their protests. So in a weird way, they believe in freedom, but only for themselves. And that's worrying, because as that happens, freedom becomes more inelastic. And you get to the point where even a small security change, something that they want, something like defunding the police, can become, which ironically makes people less secure, but it's basically one big ask from communities that don't trust the police for more security, because they believe that the police are actually taking away their security. It's very contradictory, but if you believe that the police is taking away your security, then the first thing you want is to get rid of the police, is to defund it, to move the money elsewhere, and to take the police out of your neighborhoods in order to feel more secure and more safe with where you are. Doing this means you can clearly see how that works on our security versus liberty spectrum here, where people are basically asking to have their liberty taken in order to feel more restored. And this is a bit ironic, because they believe they are actually asking for more liberty and more security when they're doing this. But the fact is, they're telling the government, hey, take more of our money and put it in other places that don't do this thing that harms us, or they want to reallocate funds in other places. They want to, what's a good way to put it? They want to give control of many aspects of our economy over to the government. So there is a bit of a, I'm not going to say there's a disconnect, but they essentially want the government to be in charge of protecting them, while telling the government that they do not want the government to protect them. They want security for financial resources and for all these other little things that they think they need, or that they've been led to believe that they need. And in doing so, they're trading, a lot of these activists are trading a lot of security. Well, they're actually trading security, but they're trading their freedom for more security, or for what they perceive as being more security. And that's the real crux of this whole situation, is that it relies on perception, not on reality. As long as people perceive something to be a specific way, then they will believe that it is that specific way, regardless of whether or not it is true. This is a real danger when the facts of reality, of society, of everything become, I'm not going to say conflated, that's not the right word, but they become all mixed up. They become confused, and there is just a wall of disinformation and one-sided information. There's a lot of sound bites. We are very much in a soundbite society, and the average soundbite has gotten shorter and shorter and shorter over the past few decades, and I studied that years ago, so it's been a good half decade more since then, where soundbites have just continued to get shorter. Originally, they used to be something like 10 or 15 seconds. Now they average less than 5. And again, I would recommend you look this up because I'm sure the data has changed a bit since I've last looked at it. But I know that sound bites have gotten much, much shorter. This is one of the reasons why I have been liking a lot of Donald Trump's presentations that he's been doing, because they haven't, a lot of the DNC and a lot of recent coverage of some Trump rallies by some mainstream media sources has actually been just playing the whole thing with commercial interruptions, and occasionally they'll stop for commentary over the presentation that's going on. I personally really hate it when they do this, but at the very least, the sound bites we're getting are better than, at least the amounts we're getting are better than those sound bites that they usually use, and that they will be using in the following days and weeks afterwards. There's that whole there is a whole cycle to this, and it's a bit scary because now, if you look online, a lot of people are getting their news from memes. So now we're at the point where you're not even getting a full soundbite, you're getting just a blurb, a little picture with a quote, or a picture with a single word on it. That's a scary thing. That's a scary thing about all of this, because suddenly people are very uninformed, misinformed, or very informed in an echo box manner. They aren't being informed of a broad spectrum of ideas. They're hearing one set of ideas, if all of that one set of ideas. They may only be hearing one range of a spectrum of ideas from one side of a political faction. And when people are only hearing such little bits, they're willing to essentially give up all of the liberties of the parts they aren't hearing. It's very turbulent and disruptive, from what I can tell, and I believe other people could do possibly a better analysis of this, or other people may have more research on this. But I find that going over what I'm seeing in terms of events, in terms of what people are asking for the government to do, what people are asking for the government not to do, it seems to me that we are on a very slow but accelerating trend of becoming more inelastic, more inelastic in our views on liberty. Because suddenly, there are states where you can't go to church on Sunday. There are states where you can't gather. There are places where you cannot defend yourself, or you will have your arms taken from you, despite those being a guaranteed liberty, and even despite some of these states being castle doctrine states where you get to defend your property. You are not subjected to running away, which the mere fact that not every state is a castle doctrine state, the mere fact that someone could be arrested for defending themselves is very scary. It just because it can be perceived by other people that they could have run away. If it is perceived that it would be possible for them to have run away, then people will be arrested for defending themselves from that mere assumption or that mere perspective. And there are people who always say there's an alternative option. So if one person believes that there's always an alternative, and they go on to a jury, they're going to go into it saying, oh, there was an alternative. He didn't have to kill that person. Therefore, if there is no castle doctrine, then that person's guilty. There are people who will go into actual courthouses with these ideas, with these beliefs. So this is a pseudo-educational, sort of informal discussion here that we're having just on kind of the state of the world and how I see it affecting our liberty from an economic perspective. And I believe that it's worth considering everything in this framing because it gives you an idea of how the country might shift in the future, or how susceptible we are to shifting in the future. If we look at everything from a broad spectrum, from an economic perspective, if we look at it in terms of transactions, and we see what people are asking for and what people stop asking for, or ask to not be done, if we start to narrow down what we're seeing from other people, then we can really see where our country is susceptible to weaknesses. We can see sort of the trend of what the American mindset is. And you can apply this to any country, I'm sure. If you look at the UK, there is a lot of scary stuff going on over there. If you look at New Zealand, in a day, they went from being a country that had gun rights, being attacked by a terrorist, to the next day, all the guns were being confiscated because they were scared from a single terrorist attack, from a foreign terrorist attack. It was someone from Australia who who attacked a mosque there. And they even specifically targeted New Zealand because it was this happy, kind of seen as like a happy-go-lucky place, like nothing bad's going to happen here type of place. But yeah, that's kind of the first part of the conversation. Now it's up to you guys. I would love to hear what you have to say on it. Do you think the idea of looking at liberty in terms of an exchange between liberty and security, do you think something other than security might be a better thing to compare it with? And do you think that as people are asking for things that they perceive to be about liberty, or to be about their own security, as people ask for more security or more features from government, are they giving up more of their liberty? Are they more willing to give up more of their liberty? Are they willing to give up what they see as being your liberty? That's the real question, because at this point, we have reached sort of a societal impasse where people are very selective about liberty, and they seem to be wanting to pick and choose what liberty is defended and what is not. So that's it for today's podcast. I hope you enjoy, and I look forward to our conversations going forward. Have a good one, everyone.